Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar today. I'm Mayor MacArthur, Art and Cultural Director of Japan House Los Angeles. Today, we're delighted to have our special guest, Morgan Pitelka from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill for the second webinar relating to our exhibition, The Art of the Ramen Bowl. His lecture will explore the history of ceramics production at Mino in central Japan, the ceramic center where the ramen bowls in the exhibition were all made. But before we meet our guest, I'd like to introduce President of Japan House Los Angeles, Yuko Kaifu, who will say a few words of welcome.
Thank you, Mayor. Hello, everyone. I wish to welcome you all to today's webinar, The Ceramics of Mino, 500 Years of Beauty and Innovation. As the Mayor mentioned, we're currently presenting the Art of the Ramen Bowl exhibition, which introduces the history, culture, ingredients, everything about Japan, ingredients of the ramen, and as well as the porcelain ramen bowls. I did not know about this, but 90% of Japan's porcelain ramen bowls, or donburi, are made in the region of Mino. But porcelain production only began in Mino in the late 19th century. Prior to that, most Mino ceramics were glazed stonewares that have traditionally been preferred and used for the tea ceremony and Japanese homes. As a matter of fact, I recently had a chance to purchase a couple of ramen bowls, which are not porcelain ramen bowls. I'm just going to show you. This, I think, is Oribe style. And this one is also beautiful. I'm really looking forward to using them, eating ramen, but also other food as well. And I would enjoy the evolving beauty of those bowls because they change their beauties as you use them for a number of times over the years. So that's an excitement as well. Today, our guest, Professor Morgan Pitelka, will trace the history of Mino ceramics from the late 16th century through the present day to give us a taste of the richness and range of ceramics born from the clay of Mino. It's sure to be a fascinating talk, and I'm personally very much interested in hearing his lecture. I now like to turn it back to Mayor, who's going to introduce the guest speaker. I hope that you enjoy, and I hope to see you in the gallery at the exhibition. Thank you. Back to you, Mayor.
Thank you, Yuko. And I love those bowls. They look like whatever you'll eat out of them will be delicious. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker. Morgan Pitelka is chair of the Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies and professor of the Department of History at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. From 2002 to 2010, he taught at Occidental College here in Los Angeles. Sorry to see him go east. His scholarship has focused on the history of late medieval and early modern Japan, with an emphasis on the samurai, tea culture, ceramics, cities, and material culture. He's the co-editor of the Journal of Japanese Studies and has published widely on Japanese tea culture, samurai culture, and Japanese ceramics, including rakuware. His newest book is Reading Medieval Ruins, Urban Life and Destruction in 16th Century Japan, published by Cambridge University Press this year. Today, in conjunction with our Ramen Bowl exhibition, Morgan will present a lecture entitled The Ceramics of Mino, 500 Years of Beauty and Innovation. Thank you so much, Morgan, for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us today. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Mayor and Kaifu-san and everyone here at Japan House. It's my honor and pleasure to speak with you all today. I'm going to be talking today about the history of Mino ceramics and really focusing in on the 17th century, which is an age of amazing efflorescent creativity in the diverse ceramic communities in the Mino region that really, in some ways, made the name of this ceramic style. I am going to begin, however, with a piece that may look unfamiliar to you. This is a Sanageware jar, which is one of the first types of glazed ceramics produced in Japan after glazed Chinese ceramics began to be imported around the 7th century. And what's important about the Sanage style of ceramics is, first of all, that they were produced in the same region as Mino ceramics. Sanage ceramics were made in communities in kilns a little bit to the south of the Toki River. That's sort of the center of Mino production, not that far actually from the modern day city of Nagoya. And they are demonstrating that Japanese potters by the 9th century were mastering the complicated techniques of creating relief decorated vessels that were glazed with a very light, a kind of pale green ash glaze. These, as you can probably tell by looking at them, are not really intended for daily use. This is a ceremonial object. And most Sanage objects, in fact, are excavated from sites associated with political and religious power. But this points to the reality that the region of Japan where the Mino tradition has long been based and where the Seto ceramic tradition also thrived for centuries, this Seto Mino region has really been one of the kind of beating hearts of ceramic production in Japan, particularly glazed ceramic production. In the medieval period, ceramics of many different types were made in the Seto region, which is directly adjacent to Mino. And a really wonderful example is this stoneware jar made using a coil construction technique, really delicately smoothed, probably using a paddle and anvil or just a wooden tool, and then is decorated with a stamped chrysanthemum design. It has a lovely greenish translucent ash glaze covering it, which reveals the pattern, the chrysanthemum pattern, but also the imperfections that are a natural result of the roughness of the clay and the effects of the firing. This is the kind of jar that would have been used for shipping and storage, but also over time, the Chinese and Southeast Asian jars that this piece is essentially imitating came to be very beloved by tea practitioners, especially wealthy merchants, powerful Buddhist priests, and the samurai warlords who were the primary political actors in the late medieval period in particular. So the Mino region and the Seto region next to it, that it was closely connected to in ceramic technology and the evolution of various ceramic techniques, produced these wonderful wares that had a utilitarian function, but also were increasingly appreciated for their aesthetic qualities. One of the real strengths of the Seto and Mino ceramic region up until the 17th century was the potter's mastery of Chinese technologies. And this tea bowl, I think, is a really wonderful example of that mastery. This is in the style of what in Japan are called tenmoku tea bowls. In China, they come from the Fujian region. These bowls were imported in large quantities to Japan throughout the medieval period and were really beloved among tea practitioners because of the brown and black iron-rich glazes that pooled and flowed in really rich naturalistic patterns. They made the perfect backdrop for the green matcha or powdered green tea that was de rigueur in the 15th and 16th centuries and beyond in the Japanese tea ceremony. And the most valued tea bowls were those imported from Fujian, but over time, the Seto kilns in particular produced really wonderful examples of this style. They never quite mastered some of the special glaze and kiln effects that made the Jianware Chinese bowls so incredibly valuable, but they still were beloved in Japan and entered into the collections of many powerful warlords and other collectors in the world of tea. Now, it's in the early 17th century that we start to see something really new happen in Japanese ceramics in many parts of the country, but I think we can say especially Mino. Mino is located in, very broadly, the central part of Japan. It is rural, but accessible from the imperial capital of Kyoto. And it seems that in the late 16th century, tea practitioners in Kyoto and in the nearby port city of Sakai started to experiment more and more in their selection and arrangement of utensils for a tea gathering, which is a little bit like a party or a banquet but a little more formal, a little more choreographed. And these tea masters and tea practitioners felt that they could express their own sort of worldview, their own aesthetic preferences, their own taste through the selection of interesting objects to drink tea out of, to prepare tea in, to store the water in. All the utensils that were used in a tea gathering became an expression of the personality, even the individuality, we might say, of these tea practitioners, almost like a designer. And we believe that they were working with two different sets of potters, at least. Some potters who lived in the city of Kyoto. The most famous known to us today would be the raku potters, who fired their ceramics in very small kilns in the city. Much more voluminous as producers were the Mino potters, who had large multi-chamber climbing kilns and could fire really enormous quantities of tea bowls and other objects for use in tea or at the table. And these tea practitioners in Kyoto would place orders with very specific instructions, it's believed, about the kinds of objects they wanted to receive. So this collaborative relationship between merchants, there were tea utensil merchants in Kyoto near Sanjo Avenue, which is a big boulevard that still exists today. Archaeological excavations have shown that they had huge collections of Mino ceramics in all different kinds of experimental styles. So a tea bowl like the one that you see here on the screen, which is not in a Chinese style, it's gesturing towards the black and brown glazes of the Jianware or Tenmoku tea bowls. But this black Seto glaze, as it's known, the Setoguro glaze, it's milky and thick so that it actually crawls in places around the rim. That would be seen as a defect by many potters, but in this experimental ethos of the late 16th and early 17th century, it was a benefit. It was a plus, a bonus. It added value to the tea bowl as a really original object. And so this black Seto style, which has an almost kind of avant-garde asymmetry, is really strongly associated with the innovative Mino tea wares of the early 17th century. Another style that in some ways has become even more well-known around the world because it has been adopted as a kind of glaze formula by Western potters is the Shino style. And here we see a really wonderful example of a Shino tea bowl. Now, what makes this special is, first of all, I would say the form itself. So this is a wheel-thrown bowl that has been somewhat roughly thrown, very deliberately, but roughly thrown so that it's got a wandering mountain path rim. It's a little bit off balance. And then it's been altered after it's removed from the wheel by the potter with wooden tools, sometimes creating facets, in this case, marking with a vertical hatch here at the front and also in other places on the bowl. Then in the glazing, we really see the Shino style emerge. So you can see the image of a bridge, and on the other side of the bowl, a house. This is applied, this is an iron oxide solution that's been applied with a brush. And then the whole bowl has been covered with a white milky glaze, kind of ash glaze with feldspar in it, that is not see-through, right? It clouds our view of the bridge, but the bridge is still visible through it, almost as though we're seeing the bridge through the fog or through clouds. We can see the thumbprint of where the potter held the bowl when the piece was glazed. And so there's this, again, this kind of naturalistic quality that really gives a lot of Shino wares a powerful flavor of sort of individuality. Each one of these objects has its own personality. Some Shino wares also can be found among tableware, dishes that were used to serve food during the tea ceremony, and also just wares for the table. But on the whole, these were very desirable, valuable, expensive pieces. So unlike later Mino ceramics, and unlike the wonderful examples of ramen bowls that we see in the exhibition in Japan House, these are going to a very small clientele in Kyoto, really almost exclusively for use in the tea ceremony. Another interesting style that came out of these same Mino kilns is called yellow Seto. It's not quite as common on tea bowls as the black Seto and the Shino glaze. Instead, we tend to see yellow Seto used a little bit more often on serving bowls and serving dishes. And it's a very modest yellow glaze, an ash glaze, that is often applied to a vessel that has been decorated with some kind of incision. Sometimes there are splashes of iron or even a copper-bearing oxide solution underneath the glaze. But on the whole, these are among the least decorated of the ceramics made in this early 17th century Mino tradition. But they're very elegant. If you ever see a yellow Seto plate or dish with steamed vegetables or fish on it, it's a really beautiful way to present food. And it works very well in the kaiseki tradition of serving food during a tea gathering. Now, this is a kind of beguiling piece that I wanted to show because it bridges us between the Shino style and the style that I won't name for a moment that is perhaps the most famous style to come out of the Mino tradition. So this sake bottle is in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it's labeled in their collection as a Shino type object. And that's because the bottom half of this bottle indeed has the characteristics of a Shino piece. So a potter or maybe even a painter who worked in the kiln, in the workshop, applied an iron oxide decoration using a brush, very calligraphic, to the side of the bottle. And then that's been covered by this milky, translucent Shino glaze. But what's unusual is that we have this copper-bearing, very thick glaze on the top of the bottle. And it's actually dripping down the front of the bottle in this beautiful effect that would have been desired by the potter, but hard to control. If it drips too far, the piece sticks and you have to break it off. If it doesn't drip far enough, it's not really that interesting. But here we just have a perfect example of the collision of natural forces in the kiln with the intentionality of the potter. A really wonderful piece. This green glaze is most famous in the style of ceramics that come from these Mino kilns known as Oribe. Now, the name Oribe comes from the name of a famous warlord of the early 17th century who was a very devoted tea practitioner. And it's claimed that he loved radical aesthetics. He loved bold designs. The problem with associating Oribe with the style of wares that I'm going to show you now and talk about a little bit is that we don't have strong documentary evidence linking him to this style. We know he liked bold ceramic designs, and this Odybe style indeed is bold, but it may be that the name was attached to this style of ceramics in later decades after Odybe's death. We don't really know. This is an area of interest for historians. But this unusual style is one of the most innovative traditions to emerge from the Mino kilns. So here on the screen, we see a dish for serving food or sweets in a tea gathering or at a banquet, even just at the table, in the shape of a double fan with a very elegant arced handle. So this is a stoneware piece that would have been constructed from slabs and using molds, and then very carefully glazed to produce these unusual effects. So what we see here, gesturing towards the Shino style, we see iron oxide designs applied with a brush with a kind of milky white translucent glaze over them. But then on the edges of the bowl, in a startling asymmetrical pattern, on the right and the left, we have this bold green copper glaze. This sometimes is called an Oribe glaze, although really Oribe refers to the whole style, the mixture of the brown or black decorations under a white translucent glaze, combined in innovative ways with the green copper glaze. That overall is the Oribe style. Another wonderful example is this set of 6 side dishes. It's quite common to see sets of 5 or 6 dishes called Mukozuke that would be used to serve food of various types in a tea gathering as part of the kaiseki, the very high quality, subtle and nuanced food tradition that developed alongside tea. These are all stoneware. They again have that same iron oxide decoration covered here with an almost completely translucent glaze, and then that copper-bearing green glaze around the rim. And what I love about these dishes is the way they're all different. They each tilt slightly in a different direction. They have individual characteristics. Each one is unique, and yet they're obviously a set. And when you eat food in a Japanese restaurant, if you have a kaiseki meal in the course of a long tea gathering, you'll encounter ceramics like this. And it's one of the, I think, real strengths of Japanese tea culture and its effect on Japanese food culture, that you don't just have local ingredients, seasonal ingredients, you also have local ceramics. And you serve your food, you serve your sake in ceramics that you have purchased to express your individuality, to express your taste, right? It's related to that idea of the tea practitioners in Kyoto being designers and finding their own aesthetic vision through the selection and arrangement of objects. In Japanese food culture influenced by tea, it's believed you can do that through the selection of ceramics for dishes, for serving side dishes as well. Now, the vibrant and sort of experimental ceramic traditions of the Mino kilns in the early 17th century sort of quieted down over the course of the 17th century, but the rest of the Tokugawa or Edo period, so the late 17th century, the 18th century, and the early 19th century, saw a really remarkable diversification of ceramic production in Mino. You have ceramics being made in the Mino region, you have ceramics being made in the Seto region, but you also have ceramics being produced at the direction of the feudal lord of the Owari domain, the kind of political unit that surrounded Mino. And the headquarters was based in Nagoya, and the ruling Owari Tokugawa family, a branch of the Tokugawa shogunate, actually sponsored ceramic production of various sorts in the domain. And one of their interesting projects was to invite potters to come to Nagoya Castle and in the garden of the castle to set up a kiln and to bring potters in to basically run a ceramic workshop, which would allow the samurai leaders, the scholars, and some of their urban commoner comrades to come into the garden for a gathering and see the potters making pots. Maybe the warriors would even have the chance to brush on some designs or to incise the outside of a pot. And one of the styles that emerged is referred to as Ofuke ware because of the Ofuke garden that was in Nagoya Castle. So this is technically made in a different location than the Mino wares that I showed you earlier, but I think it's a wonderful example of the reach of Mino ceramics, because even here in this really lovely greenish ash glaze, you see hints of that Oribe style. And this bowl has the same quality, I think, of a modest asymmetry, right? It's not as radical as the black Seto tea bowls we saw earlier. Instead, it's a little bit more understated, but it, to me, sort of gestures to those really radical Mino tea bowl traditions from the same province from earlier in the period. The Owari Tokugawa, the feudal lords of this domain, also had an estate in the city of Edo, which was, of course, the capital city of Edo period or Tokugawa period Japan. And in the gardens of their estates in Edo, they also set up small kilns. They invited some of the raku potters, for example, to come to Edo and performatively fire, make tea bowls and then fire the kiln. And so we amazingly have tea bowls in the raku style attributed to warrior leaders who made ceramics in kilns sponsored by this same domain in various locations in Nagoya or Edo, sometimes in the raku style, sometimes in the Mino styles. So a really amazing diversification that happened over the course of the Edo period. Now, as we already heard, porcelain, which is of course distinct from stoneware, as I've been describing, most of the ceramics in the Mino style to be. Porcelain was not produced in Mino until the 19th century, after Japan had begun to modernize and industrialize, and really had a very distinctive form of modernity in which it was proud of its traditional crafts, but also was rapidly modernizing, almost kind of weaponizing its traditional craft industries to try to compete with Western industrial craft and art producers. And porcelain at that time was brought as a technique, and the particular materials needed to do porcelain, to the Mino region, and porcelain became a real specialty of Mino kilns. Over the course of the Meiji period and into the Taisho and Showa periods in the 20th century, the Mino kilns became some of the most important producers of tableware. So here we see from the exhibition this remarkable collection of kozara, these small dishes made of porcelain, very regular in their shape, but really interesting in their designs, with these wonderful copperplate transfer printed motifs, resulting in the kind of blue and white or kosometsuke style that came from China originally, but here becomes a ubiquitous part of the Japanese table in the modern age. And these kinds of small dishes or small rice bowls with very similar designs can, of course, be purchased in Japan today. Not the Meiji antiques like this collection, but you can really easily use these types of objects or acquire and use these types of objects at your own table. And this display from the exhibition, I think, shows that really clearly. Lastly, the kind of variety of technologies that have been explored in the Mino region in the latter half of the 20th century is really stunning. Here on the top of this slide, I'm showing you just three examples. So on the left, we have these very fine, super high quality European style porcelain mugs, basically, where Japanese porcelain producers are competing with the highest grade porcelains made anywhere else in the world. We also have a remarkable range of tile production, porcelain tile production happening in Mino. And we even have ceramic knives, right? The materials science research has advanced the production of ceramics that can be sharpened like steel, but are react to the stress of repeated use in very different ways, and therefore are very useful for certain types of cooking. I didn't include an image of the remarkable brake. I think it's an aircraft brake that is made from ceramics in the Mino region that can withstand incredibly high temperatures in a way that most braking materials cannot. But then below them, far more appetizing, forgive the pun, these two wonderful ramen bowls that very much connect us back to the Mino tea bowl traditions from the early 17th century. On the left, from the exhibition, we have a noodle bowl that is very clearly referencing the yellow Seto style of the early 17th century. And on the right, we have a wonderful noodle bowl that is referencing the black Seto style from these early 17th century Mino wares. So we really have, in this one part of Japan, unusually, a wonderful kind of snapshot of the whole history of Japanese ceramics, particularly the history of the glazed ceramic traditions. There are, of course, really important unglazed or natural glazed ceramic traditions in Japan that you may have heard of. Probably most famous is the Bizen tradition, in which the only decoration on the finished stonewares is natural ash deposits from the firing of the kiln, sometimes even just the markings that are left by the flame or by the hot atmosphere on the inside of the kiln. Sometimes straw will be wrapped around pieces to produce amazing flares on the outside of Bizen ceramics. And then shigaraki ceramics, where ash from the wood that heats the kiln is manipulated to fall on the ceramics in really wonderful patterns and designs. So those styles perhaps are not represented in Mino, but almost every other tradition, I think, shows up in the history of Mino ceramics. And in fact, in the contemporary period, there are indeed potters in the region who work with unglazed and natural ash glazed traditions. So you really have it all in this one part of Japan. And since Japan is such a, is a country that has such a rich and diverse set of ceramic traditions, that's very unusual. If you go to one region of Japan, usually you find one style of ceramics. For me, the reason that that diversity exists is a combination of factors. It's the natural resources that are available along the Toki River in the hills around Mino that provided potters with clay, with ash, with the materials they needed to produce these innovative ceramics. It's the pre-existing Sanage tradition and other older traditions in the region that gave that kind of technological foundation for innovation. And then it's the relative proximity to the imperial capital of Kyoto that allowed for this collaborative production with merchants and tea practitioners sending letters and even sending representatives who would make certain types of demands. I want this kind of tea bowl, I want this kind of glaze, no, more radical shapes. And then the relatively rapid shipment of ceramics back to the capital, which would then inspire further orders from the kilns in Mino. I love that if we go back to this earlier slide, some of the most startlingly iconic and sculptural tea bowls you will ever see, like Iron Mallet here, are produced in region where there are multiple kilns with lots of different potters and artisans all taking part in the production process. This is not the result of just one individual artist or one individual designer. It's really a product of the cultural change that's happening in Japan in this period. Something that I, as a historian, am very interested in indeed. So I think I'm out of time, but I'm very excited to take your questions and talk more about ceramics in the Mino region of Japan. Thank you.
Thank you, Morgan. That was fascinating. And what a joy to hear you talking about all these different types of Japanese ceramics. I became an art historian because I love Japanese ceramics very much. So I am in a very happy place right now. We have a few questions, but I actually wanted to open with a question. It's kind of a big question, but based on one of the questions from the audience, an audience member, and it's about the differences between different types of ceramics. We have earthenware, stoneware, and porcelain as the main three types of ceramics, the names that we give to the three major types of ceramics in the West. And a lot of the history of Mino ceramics is basically stonewares. And then late in the 19th century, you see the emergence of porcelains, which is what Mino predominantly produces today. And in fact, as Kaifu-san mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, that now Mino produces 90% of Japan's porcelain ramen bowls. It also produces a huge proportion of Japan's porcelains, period. So it's a major producer of porcelain now. For our audience who are members who are not really as knowledgeable about the different types of ceramics, could you explain the difference between stoneware and porcelain, and also how both types of ceramics have been valued in Japan?
Sure. Yeah, I'll go even a little broader than that.
Question,
so the three big categories that are discussed in English are earthenware or low fire ceramics, and these are ceramics that are fired to a lower temperature, usually around 1,000 degrees centigrade, and as a result are not as fused. That's a non-technical word. They're less vitrified than higher temperature ceramics. So a flower pot, for example, we all know will sort of absorb the water out of the soil, right? It's not truly sealed. Stoneware is fired to a higher temperature, usually above 1,000 degrees centigrade, and has been fused more thoroughly. It's more vitrified, and especially if it's glazed, it's really truly waterproof. So one easy way, although only do this with your own ceramics, to tell the difference between earthenware and stoneware pieces is that an earthenware vessel, if you tap it with your finger, it will thud. It will make a low thudding sound, whereas a stoneware piece, if you tap it with your finger, will ring. And that's because it is a little bit more glassy, especially if it's been glazed. Now, porcelain carries this same process even further. Porcelain wares are the most vitrified, the most glassy of all ceramics. And they're only possible with a very refined kind of clay that historically was found primarily in China. And so porcelain production originated in China, and for thousands of years was, not thousands, 1,000 years was really limited to China. And then eventually it was also reproduced in Korea and in Japan, where natural porcelain deposits were discovered. Porcelain, I grew up in a pottery studio and I know how to make pots. And if you've ever tried to throw with porcelain clay, you'll know that it's considerably more difficult than throwing with earthenware or stoneware clay because it has less sand in it. It is buttery and harder to manipulate. So actually a lot of porcelain pieces are produced using molds or even by filling, a shape with liquid porcelain and then allowing it to harden. One thing I want to note is that this typology of earthenware, stoneware, and porcelain is not necessarily followed in Japan. People often refer to earthenware as soft ceramics, and then they would distinguish between stoneware and porcelain by calling one toki and the other jiki, but it's not really considered as hard and fast a distinction as it is among Western potters.
Thank you, Morgan. That's a great explanation. And before we move on to the next question, I just wanted to say that in my experience in Japan, that whereas in China, porcelain is considered to be the finest type of ceramic, in Japan, it's the stonewares that have the more historical value. They're the more national treasures in Japan are stonewares than porcelains,
It's interesting, isn't it? I will just quickly say, though, that porcelains were not made in Japan until the 17th century, but they were widely imported into Japan and circulated in Japan. So my most recent book is about a provincial city from the 16th century. And even in the modest households, archaeological excavations have shown that porcelain was used at the table. So people who didn't live in Kyoto, they lived out in the provinces in a modest urban center, had access to Chinese porcelains to buy for their table in the medieval period.
Very interesting. Can't wait to read your new book.
Thank you.
So I had one more question about what you mentioned about the location of the Seto Mino kilns being fairly close to the capital. They're pretty much also midway between the old capital, Kyoto, and the new capital, Edo. So do you think that perhaps that's what allowed the kilns to really thrive during the Edo period as well? There was all this connection to the old capital, but also a lot of the market would have been Edo. And so they could continue to furnish ceramics to people in Edo, the new political capital.
Yeah, I mean, indeed, that's a great point. We all know, if we've been to Japan, that probably the most active corridor in the country is the train line that links Tokyo to Kyoto, and that's called the Tokaido. That is a train line that is built on top of an ancient highway, and that has long been one of the most traveled routes in all of Japan, and it would have brought merchants and huge armies of warriors and migrating laborers and peasants through this area, going in both directions, not only in the Edo period, but earlier, in the medieval period and before as well. So indeed, even though when you visit parts of the region that feel very rural and isolated, you might think, wow, I'm really out in the boonies here. In fact, this is the most central part of Japan. And I think that really was to the advantage of the Mino potters.
And one of our audience members asked a great question. Were all of these different styles that were produced in Mino, say in the early 17th century, you had the Kiseto, the Setoguro, the Oribe, and Shino, were they all produced by the same potters, or would you have potters who just produced Shino ware, potters who just produced Oribe ware? What do we know about that?
So I'm really working from the research of other scholars. I'll mention that the archaeology of the Seto and Mino traditions is really ongoing. One of the things that is so incredibly exciting about studying Japanese ceramics is that new finds are happening all the time. I mean, not only are new heirloom pieces being discovered, where an amazing tea bowl or an incredible water jar will come out of someone's storehouse, someone's collection that hasn't been seen in a century, but archaeological excavations actually produce new evidence that allows us to understand better what kilns were active in what periods and to try to figure out well, this heirloom piece that we used to think was made in the 16th century was actually made in the 17th century. Those kinds of stylistic timelines are always being refined. There are a lot of kilns in the Seto and Mino regions, and there are certain periods in the history of the evolution of these ceramics when they are using the same glazes, they have the same kinds of kilns, and then there are other periods when Seto's doing one thing, Mino's doing something else, and then there are moments when different kilns in Mino are specializing in different styles. Louise may be more up to date on the archaeological evidence, but as far as I know, we can't usually link a single style to a single kiln. Certainly most of those really innovative wares that I was talking about from the early 17th century seem to have been made at a collection of kilns around the Toki River in the very heart of Mino country, basically. But we don't have it narrowed down to a single location as far as I know.
Thank you. We have another question about the patrons of Mino ware, and you talked about the tea ceremony, and obviously the tea ceremony was something that was only practiced by people at slightly higher level of society. But what type of ceramic, what type of Mino wares would the ordinary people have consumed? And presumably the kilns were producing ceramics for not just tea masters and tea practitioners, but what would the ordinary people have used? Would it have been a type of Mino, a type of Oribe ware or Shino ware or Ofuke ware, perhaps?
So I think most of the pieces that I showed today are pretty elite works that would have been in demand among, as you said, wealthy urban customers. So we're talking about powerful warlords and warrior tea practitioners, wealthy merchants, wealthy artisans, Buddhist priests, Shinto shrine heads, those kinds of elite figures. But some of the Seto and Mino kilns also seem to have produced a lot of tableware. And there's a kind of generic style of black and brown glazed tableware that you find in a lot of late medieval and early modern consumer excavation sites. So what I mean by that is sometimes archaeologists go and dig up kilns, but sometimes they go to where regular people lived, not so much peasants, but in cities or small cities, and they excavate a location where generations of people lived. And frankly, what they're looking at is their trash. And so from a trash pit, you can see, oh, there were these incredible Chinese porcelains used in this period, and then they were largely replaced by Seto black and brown wares or whatever, right? So you have this evolution in what tableware is in style, and the proportions change in different periods and also from place to place because they had different networks of circulation. One town might have been connected through a shipping firm to Echizen kilns. Another town might have been connected through a shipping firm to the Mino kilns. So it's a little hit or miss, but I do think tableware, small bowls, small plates, glazed with, relatively generic black or brown glazes or with greenish ash glazes are found in other parts of Japan throughout this period.
And just a quick question from me. You mentioned the influence of Seto styles on Mino wares, the black and the yellow in particular.
Yeah.
But you also, I think, during the Edo period, have some influence of Mino styles like Oribe ware on Seto wares. I've seen some aburazara, the sort of oil plates that are decorated in, they're made in Seto, but they're done in an Oribe style. So how much do you think, even though the Mino potters were creating, they were very diverse in their styles and they experimented many different clays and artistic styles, but were there many other kilns that were influenced by Mino wares too? Did it go that way as well?
Yeah, indeed. As far as we know, the influence was going in most directions. It was incredibly complex. I mean, this is a little bit like if I mention Kansas City, you're going to want to know, are you talking about the Kansas City in Missouri? Or are you talking about Kansas City and, in Kansas? Or, I mean, it's just not clear because these are relatively arbitrary political lines that we think, looking back on history, are clear because we have maps that make them clear, but that may not have been clear in the ebb and flow of a society that was, for much of the late 16th and early 17th century, at war, right? So it's really hard to say exactly how the influence flowed. And so, to be honest, I feel a little bad saying this because this is an exhibition that is so clearly focusing on the Mino tradition. But in my own teaching and my own thinking, I tend to kind of glom them together and say Seto and Mino ceramics, because it's so hard to disentangle the strands of influence.
For sure. I'd better get to some more of the audience questions. I'm asking too many of my own. There's one question here in particular about the ramen bowls, because this is an exhibition that focuses on the porcelain ramen bowls. Do you have any idea as to why Mino would have come to dominate the porcelain ramen bowl production in Japan, considering it just began porcelain, producing porcelain wares in the 19th century?
Yeah. I want to be really honest and say my specialty is the 16th and 17th century. So I'm going out on a limb here, but I'm not afraid to do that. I would think some of the same factors that made Mino such an important region in the production of teaware in the 17th century positioned it perfectly to dominate the production of these very functional, but also quirky and interesting ramen bowls in the 20th and into the 21st century. So again, the existence of a technological foundation that goes back 1,000 years, right? So one of the things I didn't mention in the talk is that some of the most advanced kilns used anywhere in Japan are found in the Mino and Seto region. In the medieval period, those were called anagama. They were these tunnel kilns, these sloping kilns built into the side of a hillside that were very efficient, very effective, use the laws of physics to create an efficient structure for firing large quantities of ceramics. And then those evolved over time. And we think, this is debated, but through the innovations of the potters themselves into what are called noborigama, these multi-chamber climbing kilns, where you can control each chamber so that it has different effects, and you can effectively have different sort of batches of ceramics through one massive firing. That provided a foundation for the industrialization of ceramics in the modern period that was really hard to replicate in other parts of Japan. So I think that's one major factor. Another is the fact that Mino potters were specialists in glazed traditions, right? So both in the teaware, well, before the arrival of teawares, when they were essentially riffing off of Chinese styles, then with the innovative teawares of the 17th century, and then with all the tablewares and warlord commissioned elite wares of the Edo period, and then once porcelain came in as well, all of that is this sophisticated, technologically advanced glazed ceramic traditions. And again, that positioned them well to pivot into this modern industry. Finally, I'll just say that the region around Nagoya did not become any less important with the modernization of Japan. In fact, with the move of the imperial capital from Kyoto to Tokyo, that only cemented the central region of Japan as the key corridor. And so as train lines, as new systems of shipping and circulation, the proximity to the inland sea would have perfectly positioned the Mino region to really dominate this sector of ceramic production.
And the timing also, because ramen really was only introduced to Japan in the late 19th century, and this coincided with the time that the Mino kiln started to produce porcelain. So timing is always really important, I think. We have somebody in the audience mentioning that the Tajimi, Toki, and Dachi in particular in Mino are producers of donburi. So I just wanted to share that with everybody.
Awesome. Thank you.
And we have a few technical questions. We've got a couple more minutes left for questions. A number of people are asking about the type of wood. Is there a specific type of wood that would have been used for certain types of firing? Are there positions in the kiln that certain types of Mino wares would fire better in, for specific glazes, for example? And then are potters today trying to reproduce some of these early 17th century styles? How are they doing that? So that's quite a lot of questions.
So I'll say, first of all, that it's very hard to know what kind of wood was used in the kiln at the time. because it's ephemeral, right? I mean, one of the things that happens is all the wood is burnt and turned into, vapors or ash intentionally. So you can look at the patterns of planting forests in the region. You can try to look at records of where wood was brought in from, but I don't know the answer to that question. And we also could look at what potters today who make these style of tea bowls use, but that would not, that's very anachronistic. That would not tell us what people were using at the time. And that actually leads me to another point that I think is important and that I didn't mention at all, but is one of the most remarkable aspects of the history of those 17th century Mino tea wares. And that is that the history of those wares was basically lost. And it was unknown up until the early 20th century where those tea bowls were made. We had all these heirloom examples. We had these wonderful tea bowls in tea collections, but we didn't know where the kilns were that produced them. And there was a lot of hypothesizing about, that history. The discovery of those kilns led to a lot of mythologization of the tradition, and a lot of the wonderful early kind of individualist traditional potters of 20th century Japan imagine themselves to be the inheritors of this tradition from the 17th century. But unlike the raku tradition that I've also discovered, where you literally had a tradition father to son, passing down the line all the way up to the present, that tradition was broken in Mino for a very long time, and the emphasis really shifted elsewhere. So it's a complicated history, and it's very hard to know how the kiln was arranged, where the wood was farmed from, and what type of wood it was, et cetera, because we're excavating kilns and we're trying to recover the production side. But most of what we know comes from tea diaries and from heirloom ceramics like the ones that I showed you. So we have a very patchy, anachronistic view of this important artistic tradition.
And there are a few more questions. I knew I wasn't going to get to ask you them all. I'm so sorry to everybody, but I guess I have to end with this one. What's your favorite type of Japanese ceramic? And it doesn't have to be from Mino, but of course we would like it to be for this exhibition.
That question is from Britt, who's one of my former students from Occidental College, who is herself a tea practitioner. Wonderful to have a question from you again after all these years. I can't choose among my babies. They're all beautiful. I guess maybe I'll say that, the year after I graduated from college, I had a Watson Fellowship that allowed me to go to Japan for a year and travel all over Japan, living with families of potters. And I lived and studied in Kyoto, in Mashiko, in Bizen, in Karatsu, in Hagi, and so many other places. And it was a real, transformative experience, life-changing experience. And I think the style that I loved the most in that year was Hagi, which is a glazed tea tradition, although they also make tableware in Yamaguchi prefecture, that was founded by Korean potters who were brought from Korea at the end of the Imjin War. Some abducted unquestionably, some may have come willingly, although it seems unlikely considering the circumstances, but who settled eventually in Hagi and produced this incredible ceramic tradition that I really love. And their descendants still live and work in Hagi today. It's a beautiful little town on the coast, and wonderful milky white glazed tea bowls. Various types of ash glazes are used in that tradition. And the clay is just so distinctive in Hagi ware. So that's probably my favorite.
Thank you for your honest answer. I spent a wonderful birthday in Hagi many years ago. I love Hagi ware as well. But we are big fans of Mino ware. I have to say I absolutely love Shino and Oribe ware and always have. Now, I'm afraid I'm going to have to close the webinar now. It's such a shame to wrap it up. And on behalf of everyone here, I'd just like to thank you, Morgan, for such an illuminating lecture. And clearly, you're very passionate about Japanese ceramics too. So it's lovely to share this time with you. And thank you to everybody for all your questions. I apologize for not being able to get to all of them. I'm excited to let you know that very soon, Japan House LA will be hosting our Ramen Discoveries food series, where you can actually taste ramen from different regions of Japan that will be served, made by various different ramen restaurants from LA. So if you're dying to taste some great ramen, and I know one person in the audience asked about recommendations for a ramen restaurant, come and try our ramen discovery series, which will begin in early May and run through July. So we'll be serving a lot of ramen this summer at Japan House LA. And I'd like to remind everybody that many of the webinars that we show live are recorded and posted on our website, including the Delicious Design webinar from 2 weeks ago that was about the design of these ramen bowls with our guests, the exhibition curators. They're all available to watch on our website. And today's will be available probably in a week or so as well. And you can stay up to date on all our events by subscribing to the Japan House Los Angeles newsletter. Today, when you exit the program, please take a moment to fill out our survey so that we can see what you enjoy and continue providing content that's relevant to your interests. And thank you all for joining us today. And a huge thank you to Morgan Pitelka for his terrific talk on Mino ceramics. And I'd like to wish you all enjoy the rest of your day and stay safe, everyone. Thank you.